Good evening, everyone. My name's Selina Robertson, and I work at the ICO, and I am a curator for the Cinema of Ideas. The Cinema of Ideas is the ICO's new innovative virtual screen that we launched in August. And we're going to be running this project until next May. If you want to find out more about the Cinema of Ideas, you can either sign up to the ICO's newsletter that Sammy's going to drop in the chat, or we have a website, www.cinemavofideas.org.uk. This event, just a quick housekeeping, this event is going to be live captioned. Jennifer is going to be doing the captioning, and that will come on, well, be on now. And if you have any questions to either of our speakers, please put them in the chat and Sammy will field them through. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce this evening's conversation. We welcome Tony Rayns and Simon Ward. This is the first of a series of free events that we'll be hosting on the platform, where we invite a particular person who's been working in the film industry for a very long time, who we've admired for a very long time, and who you might not have heard speak. You know, you might have read his work, you might have seen a program that he's curated, but you might not have actually heard from the person himself, and that's Tony Rayns. So welcome, Tony. He's got the most incredible biography, which is on our website, and Sammy will post that in the chat as well. But Tony is a film programmer, curator, critic, and filmmaker with an incredible career behind him and in front of him still. And then also welcome Simon Ward, who is my former ICO colleague, who have known Simon for a long time, who's a film programmer himself with a very prestigious career too. He's currently a trustee of the ICO, and he is also owns the Palace Cinema in Broadstairs, which is a beautiful single screen cinema in Broadstairs in Kent. So I will hand over to Simon and Tony, and they will tell you how the evening will run. Thank you.
Thanks, Selina. And actually, Tony and myself are in Broadstairs in Kent right now because we thought it would be a little easier just to have a chat in person and see where we go. So, Tony, you have basically been a preeminent programmer, critic. I know this is going to embarrass you, but it's got to be said, internationally renowned for your knowledge across East Asian cinema, American underground cinema, first person to write, I believe, or edit a book in English on Rainer Werner Fassbinder, many great things. But like us all, you are a mere mortal who started as a student programming a film society. And I think tonight, what I'd like to do is take us on a journey, how you've progressed from that young man. What was the first thing that made you think, I'd like to put films on a screen, and talk about those first experiences? What was it that inspired you to start showing films to people in I guess, an amateur cinephile capacity?
Well, I started film societies, Simon, first in secondary school and then in university, in college. And in both cases, I was motivated primarily by booking the films that I wanted to see myself. In them days, this is a long time ago, folks, in them days, film was not readily available as a home viewing medium. If it was on television, you were lucky. If it was not on television, and most things were not on television, you were unlucky. So you grabbed every chance you could have to see films, especially films that were a little bit off the beaten track. And I discovered very quickly in secondary school that the best way to do this was to set up a film society screening, rent the films from the many distributors who were out there purveying 16mm copies, sometimes 8mm copies, and just show them and charge my schoolmates a small amount of money to see them to cover the rental.
Yeah.
that's how it worked. So it was a very frankly selfish motivation.
And how did you come across the film? How did you know what you wanted to show?
Oh, in those days, if you wanted to know, this is in the 60s, late 60s, let's say. In those days, if you wanted to know about cinema, there were relatively few books published, but there were quite a few magazines published. The BFI published the Monthly Film Bulletin, which I preferred, and Sight and Sound, which occasionally had things in it that I liked, but most of the time didn't. Movie had started publishing in the early 60s, run by a gang of Oxford graduates, most of whom went on to careers of some kind or other in film. And that aside, there was a gay magazine called Films and Filming, which was part of a stable run by a gay publisher called, it doesn't matter what he was called, but he had a company called Hanson Books. And they published books and bookmen, plays and players, music and musicians, etc., across the 7 arts. And one of them was Films and Filming. And Films and Filming, it was an interesting mixture. It carried lengthy film reviews of new releases by sometimes very interesting writers like Raymond Durgnat, Ian Johnston occasionally.
So quite an academic approach.
No, not at all academic approach, because it was accompanied by pictures mostly of naked men from up to the minute films, sometimes very negligible films that had no interest at all to the general cinephile reader, except for the fact that they contain naked men.
Right.
So the only rationale or the only reason for inclusion in Films and Filming was male nudity. Okay. So that was to me a bit of a revelation as well. I thought, what is going on here? This is quite a weird thing. But when looking at Films and Filming, you were fed a diet of cinematic erudition by the likes of Raymond Durgnat. Mm. And it was one of his mentions in Films and Filming that led me to a magazine that he co-edited called Motion, which lasted for only 6 issues, but one of those was something called The Motion Companion to Violence and Sadism in the Cinema. Wow. That was a seminal discovery. I mean, I remember taking that on school trips with me and reading it in the youth hostels every night. I mean, just immersed in the photos and the texts, which describe all manner of forbidden goods. So running the Film Society was a way to get to see some of these films.
Right, yeah. And so then you come out of university, you come out of school, and then went to university where you did a bigger Film Society. So I guess
in the university years, I ran several film societies during my college years, and several at the same time, in fact. And the biggest one, which was the Town Film Society, not necessarily linked to the university, although it was predominantly linked to the university, was really my first experience in addressing an audience. I mean, other than myself. As I said, I think the primary impulse initially was selfish. I programmed films I wanted to see. Yep. And I was happy to sit there projecting them because I was wanting to watch them anyway. I'm happy to watch them more than once if need be. In the big Film Society, which I took over in '69, I guess it was, that was the first time I'd had access to a theatre that could play 35mm as well as 16mm. At that time, lots of titles were available only on 35mm and not on 16. So this opened up all kinds of possibilities that were not there in the earlier years. And I was still guided by what I wanted to see myself, but I was also beginning to think more in terms of what audiences would want to see, or what I thought audiences should see, because there was already a considerable history of cinema, both British, American, and world cinema, that people didn't necessarily have easy access to, which I thought should be put to them. This is one of the reasons for having a film society, is to extend the range of viewing and to make people aware of all kinds of things they might otherwise not know. So I'm beginning by that time, at the end of the 60s, to think about the needs and tastes and interests of an audience and how to cultivate them.
Okay. And so then you come out of university and you've got this knowledge in your head. You must have beginning to sort of have a sense of where to get the films from, distributors, things like that, how to approach them. But how do you make that leap from, in effect, a kind of amateur exhibition and cinephile to working, say, I think, for the BFI in some capacity as a freelance?
Yes, I've only ever been a freelancer at the BFI.
Yeah.
I've never actually had a post at the BFI. To be frank, there was a little foretaste earlier in the university years when, because I established a rather close relationship with a distributor, now dead, called Jimmy Vaughan, a gentleman of Indian extraction, who lived in Hampstead, and started off in business as a partner of the American independent filmmaker Lionel Rogosin, but then very quickly left Rogosin behind, and it ceased to be Vaughan Rogosin films and just became Vaughan films. Mm-hmm. And Vaughan specialized in American underground films in Britain, and he distributed films by the Kuchar brothers, by Kenneth Anger, by Stan Brakhage even. I mean, quite unexpected people. But things began to take off in quite a big way when he acquired rights to films by Andy Warhol. And he was the first distributor of Warhol films in Britain. Mm. He brought Warhol on one of his first visits to Britain as well, so in support of the promotion of the films that he was screening. I was still at university when this happened, but established a relationship with him because of my interest in the avant-garde films that he was showing. In consequence, I got first look at the Warhol prints when they arrived, and decided to, outside of the Film Society context, I became a little bit entrepreneurial. I'm not at all an entrepreneurial type, and I've never been any good at all at making money for myself. But I did in college, as a completely private enterprise activity, rent a local cinema. It's called the Rex.
That's quite entrepreneurial, I would think.
Yes, but it was a cinema famously that had been the first in Britain to show The Wild One with Marlon Brando when the British censor banned it. It was authorised by the local authority, and the Rex was able to screen it and did so back in the early 50s. Yeah. Anyhow, this cinema was still managing to just about survive, a great barn of a place, of course, and didn't attract very much audience in the normal course of things. We put a 16mm projector on the front of the balcony and projected onto the big screen, hooked up to the cinema sound system, and showed Warhol films. We showed a week or so of Warhol films. It's a purely private enterprise thing, nothing to do with the Film Society. Okay. We sold tickets through the cinema. And we made profits for ourselves. A small group of friends and I did this because we thought it was a way of getting the films shown, and did very nicely out of it. It was we attracted big audiences. I don't know, what can I say? The audience, I'm sure, was mainly students, but it was they were curious. They'd read about these things. They were curious to know what was going on, and we did quite well out of it. And it gave me a first taste of what it might mean to do this professionally, if you like. It's not a terribly professional enterprise, but nonetheless, it was on the verge of
open the door.
Yes.
So presumably, this being the first showing of Warhol's films, presumably that led to some kind of engagement with press as well.
Not so much. We didn't really care about that. It was the local press was.
Was it local press? So you didn't get sort of wider.
National? No. Nobody was remotely interested. No.
Okay. No. And so your next step, you've done that.
I graduate. I moved to London. I start writing for the BFI magazines, initially for the Monthly Film Bulletin.
How does that happen? How do you? I was
approached by the editor. I'd met the editor, I think, at the Edinburgh International Film Festival in '69. I had shot a film to be part of a multimedia show, a student show that was put on in the Edinburgh Fringe. The show was called Make Me, Make You. It was supposed to be a satire of office girls in the swinging London of the late 60s.
Right.
And they asked me to shoot some 16mm film to use as part of the production, as part of a back projection that will be used here and there in the film with the cast. So I made day trips to London to shoot with the actors of the film on locations on London streets. And that was actually my first visit to Edinburgh, I think, was to take part in this production. The production was catastrophically bad. So the film was pretty bad as well.
Yeah.
So it had no direct consequence. But in the course of that visit, I did meet a critic called Jan Dawson, a British woman, who was at that time deputy editor of the Monthly Film Bulletin.
Right.
And she was also a contributor to The Listener, which is a magazine, a general literary magazine published by the BBC at the time, and now defunct. And so I knew her before I came to London, before I moved to London. And when I did, she was kind enough to invite me to start writing for the Monthly Film Bulletin, because I had already published for a college film magazine and other places, college newspaper as well, I published for. So I had some experience of published writing by this time. And the very first thing I reviewed for the Monthly Film Bulletin was an Andy Warhol film called Bike Boy.
Right. One you'd shown?
No, it was newly arrived in Britain. Okay. It wasn't available amongst the ones that I'd shown. I'd shown earlier things like The Shopper, which is a pastiche of Hedy Lamarr's Arrest for Shoplifting, written by Ronnie Tavel.
Right.
And what else did we show? I can't remember anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So you're writing.
Oh, we showed Vinyl, which is the first illicit adaptation of A Clockwork Orange.
Right. Blimey. So you've now got a bit of programming experience behind you on your belt.
Yes.
You're starting to become a critic. You're getting paid for it.
Yes.
And how do those two things start to merge?
They don't really. They sit side by side, not very well explored, and they're complemented by my occasional attempts to make films. I've been a moderately prolific independent filmmaker during my school and college years, making little short films, mostly one feature-length film in university. And I make
that's quite a big thing, a feature-length film.
On 8mm, but twin screen. There will be two screens projected side by side. So it was like the film was just over an hour long, but it was on two screens. So there was more than 2 hours of material. I made a desultory attempt to prolong that kind of activity when I moved to London, but in fact very quickly gave up. I did shoot a certain amount of independent film in my early years in London, but it proved impossible to sustain because the amount of effort that it takes to produce this stuff, and the cost, of course, is not proportionate to the amount of reward you can get. I don't mean financial reward, but the idea of getting somebody to see the films and to respond to them and to have any kind of dialogue around them
without any resources.
It's too much. It's impossible. So you kind of lose faith in it and give up. And I stopped making films for quite many years until the 1980s, when I started making films for Channel 4, for documentaries for Channel 4 about cinema topics, which is a whole separate thing. But anyway, I'm trying to juggle various film-related activities in the 70s, in the early 70s, and I'm getting by, I guess. I'm trying to do, I'm also editing a couple of magazines, one called Cinema Rising, which was an attempt to do a kind of Rolling Stone type magazine, but on cinema. Okay. That was very short-lived.
And what was there? Was there a kind of, Cinema Rising? I immediately am thinking of Kenneth Anger and your interest in that.
That's what Kenneth Anger
and was
Kenneth Anger rang me and said, "I hear you're running a magazine called Cinema Rising." He said, "What's that all about?"
How dare you steal my title?
I said, "Kenneth, I don't think you have copyright in it."
Yeah, but it wasn't sort of focused completely on American Underground. Or
it certainly
like
wasn't. It was a broad. It was like Rolling Stone. It was an attempt to do Rolling Stone, but with a sort of Rolling Stone at that time was an American magazine, and it had a kind of roots in the San Francisco underground, which informed what it did, although it was by no means exclusively focused in that area. And I wanted Cinema Rising to be the same. I wanted it to have a broad, plural approach to cinema in all its mystery and majesty, while at the same time having some roots in the underground. I wanted it to be in tune with some down and dirty stuff that was going on beneath the commercial surface of cinema.
Got you. Which in some ways is something that you've gone on to do throughout your entire career, I would say.
How kind of you to say so.
So we're moving on. Is the next sort of big programming project you do, is that when you start to think about Chinese cinema?
Not quite. It's an interesting thing. I have because of my work for the BFI magazines, because I'm writing regularly for the Bulletin and for Sight and Sound, by the mid to late 70s, I'm certainly a regular contributor, pretty much every issue. I am invited by the then director of London Film Festival, an American man called Ken Blashick, now sadly dead. He died, I don't know, 10 years ago. But he was at that time the head of year-round programming at the National Film Theatre, as it then was, now the BFI South Bank. But he was also the director of London Film Festival, which he was in the process of expanding from a rather small coterie event into a much more plural event with a much wider range of films being screened. And Ken hired me to edit program notes for the festival. Excuse me. The festival didn't publish a catalogue at that time, but the NFT had a tradition of providing program notes for every film it screened.
Yep.
The London Film Festival decided to do the same, but of course they wanted them to be more ambitious program notes. They wanted them with proper biographies of the filmmakers. They wanted notes ideally by the filmmaker, or if no such filmmaker text existed, replaced with something else, a critic's incisive view of the film or something, or some background information that would be helpful to the viewer. So, and he was showing up to 200 films, more sometimes, as the thing expanded. So it was quite a big, arduous job actually to edit.
Were you doing this on your own?
Yes. Cool. Researching and writing and typing in many cases as well.
Right.
Typing the templates from which the things were reproduced.
Yeah.
So that put me into the National Film Theatre.
Yeah.
It gave me a desk in the National Film Theatre where I was frequently to be found there for 2-3 months a year in the run-up to the festival. And it also meant that I was there during the festival, because then I would be asked to do various things. Like Ken Rushin, for example, asked me to give a talk on Fassbinder in the festival to mark Fassbinder's death. I mean, he wanted some occasion. He was showing, I think, the last 3 films made by Fassbinder, and said it would be nice to have alongside them a talk about Fassbinder by someone who knew him a bit. And I said, would you do that? And I foolishly said yes, and did it. And that turned out to be very useful for me in some ways, because there were some interesting people in the audience who subsequently became friends of mine, and opened up new channels of work and communication. Yeah. But that's another story. So I'm in the National Film Theatre working on these damn program notes. This coincides, though, with the beginning of international traveling. And my first foreign trip, I made some trips to Europe, of course, before this, and including a couple to Germany, which had involved Fassbinder. So my knowledge of Fassbinder had come.
Was this as a journalist?
Yes, I was asked to go by a magazine called Time Out to go to interview Rainer Werner Fassbinder in, at that time he was in Frankfurt, not in
quite a daunting early assignment, I would imagine. Fassbinder.
Yes, someone I was a little
excited too.
But yes, both. Yes. But he was, I mean, he was a little difficult, but not very. It was fine. And we got quite a good interview out of it, which has since been reprinted quite a bit, so it can't be that bad. Only a very skeletal version appeared in Time Out, but a lot more of it went into Sight and Sound. I put a longer version of it into Sight and Sound. Right. Anyway, my first long haul trips, the first extended trips I made was to Hong Kong. That was in 1977, when the Hong Kong Film Festival, then launching, was kind enough to invite me as one of the very few guests invited to its first edition. Yep. The reason they invited me was because I had been writing a lot about Hong Kong films in the monthly film bulletin. I'd been making hundreds of mistakes, no doubt, getting all kinds of things wrong, and misinterpreting things and misinforming the readers in various ways, and scrabbling for a little foothold in a culture of which I knew absolutely nothing really, but was learning fast. I mean, I was beginning to pick up some sense of what this cinema was, and who was who, and who was doing what. And
at this stage, had you already been seeing some of the Shaw Brothers' work in London?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there was a Chinatown cinema in London that showed nothing but Shaw Brothers films, another one that showed nothing but Golden Harvest films, and a third one that showed other companies' films, independent films, and there were occasional also showings of communist films from China, underground, not underground, but in little cinemas or screening rooms in Chinatown.
But these were outside of kind of formal distribution in the UK. So these were
they were in formal distribution, but in the contracts, the distribution contracts said for theatres primarily catering to the Chinese community. Yeah. That was, of course, ignored by the companies who were happy to sell tickets to anybody who wanted to come and see. Yeah. But they were bypassing censorship. The films were not seen by the BBFC. Yeah. They were simply screened in these clubs.
Not covered by the monthly film bulletin.
No, there was no point of
Yeah.
there was no chance of reviewing them.
Yeah.
I had reviewed some Hong Kong films because by the mid-70s they were being widely distributed.
Yeah.
Water Street was full of small companies that were rushing to pick up Hong Kong titles, and the way was led by EMI, who was then a big noise in British film distribution, and they bought quite a number of Shaw Brothers films and some other things.
Yep.
From Hong Kong, because of Bruce Lee had started a tidal wave in the sense everybody was interested. The films had done very good business in the British market, as in many other countries.
Yeah.
And everybody wanted a piece of it. They were largely ignorant, as was I. So they bought randomly whatever was put in front of them,
Right.
anything they liked the look of.
Yeah.
So it wasn't at all purposive, or
Yeah.
there were no intelligent choices being made on the
Sure.
for the most part. But I was part of this melee too. I was also exploring, because I was seeing films in Chinatown in the clubs, and seeing films dubbed and cut in commercial theatres,
Right.
where I was reviewing them for the monthly film bulletin. So anyway, all of this activity resulted in an invitation to Hong Kong in 1977. When I don't know, they never said this to me, but the people running the Hong Kong festival, I suspect, were aware that I was one of the few Westerners who was taking an interest in their cinema in a more serious way, but I was getting everything wrong. And they thought, let's invite him to Hong Kong, show him the reality of Hong Kong. Maybe he'll get it better. He'll understand more. He'll make fewer stupid mistakes when he discusses the films. Anyway, whatever they were thinking, it had that effect. My first trip to Hong Kong was in '77. I spent 2 months staying in Hong Kong. I had 40 friends who I'd met when they were students in London, invited me to come and stay back in Hong Kong when they were home in Hong Kong. And I spent 2 weeks exploring and getting to know the city, but also getting to know the film companies.
Yeah.
And to my surprise, the TV stations, because one of the first things I discovered was that there was an entire generation of younger filmmakers in Hong Kong, the Han Huis, the Alan Fongs, the Choi Haks, Patrick Tams, many, many others, who were not making commercial films when I first went to Hong Kong, but were making television.
Okay.
And unlike the films, they were shooting on the streets of Hong Kong. Shaw's didn't make a single film on location anywhere in Hong Kong until quite a bit later. They finally caved in in the 1980s and started to make true crime dramas on the streets of Hong Kong. But in the 70s, never. Everything was shot in the studio, which is why it all looked very much the same. Sure, always. So for me, it was a revelation to discover that these younger filmmakers were shooting on 16mm on the streets for TV, making social dramas, political dramas about real life people, mostly working class people, and bringing a strong, fresh breath of new wave cinema into the proceedings. They were utterly different from the films that I'd become familiar with. And that was, to me, a revelation. That was an important discovery.
And was one of the sort of key things I can imagine, and that would be, which again I think has followed you throughout your career and your writing, is that sense of getting to know the culture and getting to know the history, and how important that is to unpacking.
For me, to understand a film, I feel a need to know something about where it comes from. I need to know something about I want to know something about the director. In my experience, there's a pretty close correlation between the interest of a director, the woman or man who makes the film. If they are an interesting person, if they are responding to the world in an interesting way, in a questioning way, in a curious way, they are more likely to make an interesting film. The film is quite likely to reflect their personality, their openness to new ideas, their willingness to experiment or try something different, not to just reproduce an existing formula like a hack. I think this was already true in the very early years of cinema. The reason that directors like John Ford and Raoul Walsh emerged as giant figures, Frank Bolzecki would be another one, in the 1920s, is because they were like that. They were not your standard uninspired hacks. They were thinking lively individuals who had all kinds of ideas about all kinds of things, history, representation, sexual roles, sexual behaviors, adventure, physical action, and the relationship between that and other aspects of life. I mean, all of these things fed into their work, and they so it meant that their films reflected all of their questioning ideas.
Yeah.
I think it's no different now. I mean, now
Sure.
if you look at films, if a filmmaker is an interesting person, whether it's a man or a woman, it is likely that their work will somehow reflect that and communicate somehow.
Absolutely.
A vitality, something beyond the narrative surface of the film that is engaging.
Which is why they engage the audience.
A different level, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly so.
So you're in Hong Kong. You've discovered Choi Hark and An Hui, and then you're thinking, I've got to somehow get these seen back in the UK.
Well, as I am, because I'm taking great pleasure in them, and I'm finding them more exciting than most of the stuff I'm seeing in London at the time. To be honest, the 70s, I think, was not a very great period for cinema in Britain. I don't think it was a great period for cinema in Europe. I don't think it was a great period for cinema in the United States. So certainly when I saw films in Hong Kong, particularly TV films made by the younger filmmakers, or An Hui was, I think, the first one to make the transition to making a feature film. Her first feature was in '79 and called The Secret. It was a real life crime story based on a fairly recent case that had been a kind of a sensation in Hong Kong. I got a frisson from these films, a thrill from seeing them that I was not getting from most of what I was watching back home in London.
The Shaw Brothers stuff that was four-walling.
I meant generally. I meant also the British cinema, the American cinema, the European cinema.
Sure.
It was the period of the ascendancy of Swiss cinema. So we were all supposed to get excited about Claude Goretta and Alain Tanner and things like this. I could hardly stay awake. I mean, it was mega tedious to me, this stuff. So seeing this dynamic young cinema being made in Hong Kong.
And what do you do to get that shown in
well, as I told you earlier, I was being hired by Ken Washin to edit program notes for the London Film Festival. And I'm working for 2-3 months of the year in the London Film Festival office on this project, this epic project, seeing Ken and his team every day. And so I come back from a trip to Hong Kong in the spring. The London Film Festival is towards the end of the year. I move into the LFF office and I say to Ken, oh, by the way, Ken, I saw a really interesting film in Hong Kong. It's by a new director called Choi Hark, and he made a film called The Butterfly Murders. It's his first feature. I think you should show it. Oh, really? He says, okay, I'll take a chance on it. Ken was that kind of man. He was very open to ideas, and if you could describe something to him in terms that made it sound exciting or interesting, he's willing to give it take a risk on it. So, as a result of those conversations, the London Film Festival showed films that I had first seen either in Hong Kong or in the Hong Kong Festival. So I'd seen in the Hong Kong Festival, I saw for the first time films from Indonesia, from the Philippines, from Thailand. I saw some Japanese films that I hadn't previously seen or had access to. I saw some China films I hadn't previously seen or had access to. Even a few Korean things, although I have to say the Korean films I saw were not very exciting. They were very, very old-fashioned melodramas, so they didn't light my fire anyway. However, other things I came back to London recommending to Ken. I said, listen, there's this amazing Indonesian film by a great veteran director, Teguh Karya. He's made a historical drama called November 1828. I think you should show it. London Festival had never shown an Indonesian film. In fact, no major festival in Europe had ever shown anything from Indonesia. He said, okay, we'll go for it. And he invited the film. It played in London. It was quite successful. I guess it was 1980 or there, 80 or 81, I don't recall. And that was the basis for our, it was a completely informal arrangement.
Yeah,
I was not being paid as a scout. I wasn't. He wasn't paying any of my expenses in going to Hong Kong and seeing these films. However, he was very happy to accept the recommendations and thought this was a useful and valuable thing to do, and that it enhanced the festival. So he was open to, Indonesian films, Thai films. We showed Cherd Songtri's The Scar, which is, in my view, one of the greatest Thai films ever made. And Kun Cherd came to London for the screening. It was altogether successful and splendid event, I think. And we also showed a kind of lefty indie film from Thailand at the same time, made on 16mm below the radar of the censors, called On the Fringe of Society by Manop Udomde. We showed that. I said to Kem Rashin, they're both worth showing. Well, one is a kind of mainstream industry film of a very high quality, I would say. Yep. The other is a small indie film of a, with a real radical edge. Another take on that. I think we should show both, actually, because they're two sides of a coin, really. Yeah. And Ken said, "Okay, let's go for it." And that's the kind of festival director you want to work with. You fantastic. Want somebody who is open to ideas, open to suggestions, and responds with enthusiasm. I think it sounds exciting, he thinks.
So I know it didn't go this smoothly, but what happens next? So you spend a huge amount of time for years now traveling around the East, and
not only the East, but mostly the East. Yes.
And how does that get sort of paid for? How do you turn that into a living? How do you with difficulty? I mean, programming is,
of course, with difficulty. Yes. I'm on my own coin, as they say. Yeah. I have to find ways to pay for it. Yeah. I pay for it partly by writing articles about things that I've seen. Occasionally I help friends with subtitles with their films, so that's become a bit more of a thing in recent years, but in the early years it was a very informal arrangement.
People like Jajanker, and
that's later. Jajanker doesn't start making films till the late 90s, so it's much later. But in the early years it was much more informal, and I don't know, when you're young or relatively young, I guess you don't seem to need much money to live on. I mean, you can enjoy the kindness of strangers. What can I say? I think we should leave this slightly ambiguous.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And but then you do get asked by the BFI, don't you, to curate a sort of almost like a history of Chinese cinema.
No, I'm not invited by the BFI to do any such thing.
Okay.
I suggested it to them. The Chinese embassy in London had a tradition after Mao's death of, a tradition is overstating it, it's happened once. They had called up the BFI and said, "Why don't you have a Chinese film week?" And the BFI had said, "Okay, sure." And they had shown a week of Maoist propaganda films at the NFT and called it a China Film Week. Yeah. And the Chinese embassy was very happy. In 1978, they called up again and said, "Isn't it time for another China Film Week?" We
got some more propaganda.
Nice one last week. Let's do it again. Nice one last year. Let's do it again. Yeah. And for some reason or other, this invitational suggestion was not rapturously received at the National Film Theatre, and it somehow or other it was passed onto the desk of one Scott Meek, who was at that time the feature film acquisitions officer for the National Film Archive. And he knew, he was a friend of mine at the time, and he knew of my interest in Chinese cinema, particularly Hong Kong cinema, but I was of course beginning to be curious about what had been happening in mainland cinema for all these years, fed by a rather terrible book published by Jay Lyder called Electric Shadows, the first attempt at in English as an account of Chinese film history. Jay Lyder had spent some time at the archive in Beijing, helping them to catalogue their Russian holdings, because he was a communist and a specialist in Russian cinema and spoke and read Russian fluently. So the Chinese, who didn't want to invite any Russians into the place because there'd been a big schism between China and Russia, so they were looking for foreign experts who could represent Russia, as it were, without actually being Russia.
And not speaking Chinese, I seem to remember.
Jay Lyder didn't speak a word of Chinese. He had a Chinese-American wife, but she didn't speak or read Chinese either, I don't think. So
bit of a drawback.
Well, he certainly was a drawback, but Jay, who was a very nice man, while he was there for a couple of years, perhaps a little more, took every opportunity that came his way to see Chinese films in the archive. When a film was screened in the archive, he snuck in the back and watched it. He didn't understand all that much because he couldn't understand soundtracks, he couldn't read intertitles in silent films, but he asked questions and he asked other friends to translate official Chinese film histories for him into English. So he gradually began to get a picture of the development of Chinese film.
Both pre and post-revolution, or at this point?
We're focusing on pre-revolution, basically. We're talking about the great years of the 20s, 30s, and the post-war years of the 40s, particularly. he of course talks about the 50s and 60s up to the Cultural Revolution too, but he was one of the first to publicly say in Western literature the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. He was aware that many of the great filmmakers of the past were being particularly targeted by Madame Mao and were suffering and in some cases being driven to suicide. This is long before other people began to understand that this was in fact the case, that he was quite right about it, but he was because he was there and he was seeing what was happening, or had seen what was happening in the run-up to the Cultural Revolution. He understood that this was kind of a disaster for China. Anyway, he attempted, I mean, the book is strewn with errors. There are hundreds and hundreds of errors in it. He misunderstood lots of things. He missed out lots of things he didn't happen to know about or see. But he made a heroic attempt to try and chronicle the development of Chinese cinema. And it became a Bible. It was the only book published in English about the history of Chinese cinema. And so, of course, I bought it and had read it and was aware of it and wanted to know more about it. So I approached this looking for information, looking for a bigger picture of how Chinese cinema had been. So when Scott Meek calls me up to get back to the main thread of the story and says the Chinese have come on to us suggesting we do another China Film Week, what do you think? And I said, I think it's a very bad idea to do another China Film Week. It tells us nothing, useless. It's just serving their propaganda needs. Not even effectively that, because nobody is going to be persuaded by any of their terrible propaganda films.
And there's a much bigger picture. More interesting.
Why don't we come back to them and say, why don't we instead try to do a Chinese cinema retrospective, giving some sense of how Chinese cinema has evolved over the decades? And I had the naive idea at that time that we could just go to Beijing, go to the archive in Beijing, see all these films that Jay Leiter had written about in his book, and then bring the pick of them to London and do an event in London. So we did go to China at the end of 78, beginning of 79. And Mao had been dead for 2 years. The Cultural Revolution was over. China was slowly trying to return to normal. First thing we found was that the China Film Archive was still closed. It had been closed throughout the Cultural Revolution. Hadn't yet reopened. We met the people. They said, we don't even have an office or a building yet. Our vaults are still closed out in the countryside. As far as we know, nothing was destroyed that can't be replaced during the Cultural Revolution. But we haven't opened the vaults. We haven't examined anything. We're waiting till we have our own premises. Sorry, you're too early. You know, go away. Come back in a year or two. And so we despaired initially. We thought this is a complete waste of our time. Then we've screwed up here. We've messed up by not understanding the situation well enough. But then we moved from Beijing to Shanghai, and the Shanghai Studios. Shanghai is traditionally more pragmatic than Beijing. It's a much less governmental city. It's a much more relaxed city in many respects, and not every respect, but in many. And the Shanghai Studios had their own collection of pre-war titles, prints they had, which they liked to show to each other. And to, when we visited, I think we were the first visitors to come, asking to see them, you know, saying, do you have any of your pre-war
So
classics?
They were encouraging, they wanted to
They
give you
were
access.
delighted, and they put out you know, 4 or 5 or 6 even of the, you know, pre-war classics or post-war classics, but you know, late 40s before the communist victory. And we watched them and we were blown away. We thought, wow, this is cinema. You know, these are films that we can recognize. These are films that we can. It would be a huge pleasure to show these films to
So
Western audience.
Back to London.
We did our best. We had some help from the BBC, who agreed to show some of the films and pay for some of the restoration work on the copies sent, because the copies were very unrestored and in some cases not in very good nick at all when they first arrived, and needed a bit of a clean-up before they would really be shown to an audience. But in 1980, we were able to put on the world's first historical retrospective of Chinese cinema. I can't claim it was all that much, because we only showed something like 25 or 30 films.
But the first in the world.
But it was the first in the world.
Impressive.
And we did start with silent films from the 20s, and we finished with a very recent film. You know, it was hard to find a very recent film that stood up in this company, but nonetheless, we felt obliged to do that.
I feel a bit like talking to you now, Tony, is a bit like trying to tell the whole of Chinese cinema history in 20 films, because I'm looking at the time and realizing we've got about 15 minutes left, and we haven't.
Oh, God,
you know, there's an entire programming career of the London Film, not career, but a decent chunk of time at the London Film Festival, Vancouver Film Festival. You've contributed to the Rotterdam International Film Festival. So I suppose we should start to think about throwing open some questions about that.
Oh.
We got something here.
When I look at this the screen, I can see several questions.
Yeah, so we got one here, which is,
Yeah.
do you remain as pessimistic about the future of thoughtful film criticism as you were 10 years ago, or more so? Are you pessimistic?
I can't remember what would have specifically provoked that. I probably was. I mean, it has a familiar ring to it. Yes, I think the spaces to publish thoughtful film criticism are definitely reducing. Obviously, the rise of the internet and internet critics has contributed to that in some sense, because the internet, like most social media sites, promotes a much glibber kind of criticism. I mean, there are some very good online sites devoted to cinephile research of various kinds.
Sure.
And there have been since quite early on. I mean, Masters of Cinema, now a distinguished Blu-ray publishing label, started life as a cinephile website. It was originally, you know, a team of people who were like-minded in their enthusiasm for cinema, not necessarily in tune with much commercial releases of their moment, and wanted to highlight what they thought were the key figures from cinema's history, including sometimes the present or near past anyway. And that set the pattern. There are plenty of those. There's a site called Rouge, there's a site called Senses of Cinema. There are many, actually.
For sure, yeah. There's a lot of noise.
So
I'm
not saying, I'm not trying to be a blanket critique of all of this stuff.
Yeah.
There is some very good stuff that appears online, and there's still, despite the press, the commercial pressures, there's still a small amount of stuff that appears in print that is worth reading and worth thinking about. However, you've got to say that the amount of what you call noise, and I think it's a good word, does tend to overwhelm the rest. And certainly it makes it harder for the more thoughtful stuff to reach a wider readership.
Absolutely.
Because it blocks, it occludes the way. It makes it harder for the more thoughtful stuff to get through. So even if the good stuff is intelligently positioned and thoughtful and not elitist in its tone, so it speaks to the average film goer in some way, and tries to persuade that person, male or female, that the film under discussion might be of interest to them. It's very hard to get through. Yeah,
and to make it visible, and to make something interesting stand out, and which I guess is one of the roles of programming and criticism, is to, it's not a gatekeeper so much to keep things out and a place of privilege, it's a place to champion interesting new work.
I'm very conscious that, I mean, I hope and believe that I have written some thoughtful film criticism in my time.
Surely have.
But I'm very conscious that a lot of the writing I do has been for things like festival catalogues, where the job is essentially a PR job. Your job is to persuade the reader that this film is something they might want to take a chance and go to see, even if they've never heard of the film, the filmmaker, the film itself, or indeed know anything much about the country that it comes from. Now, obviously, it's a bit harder to do that if you're talking about an Indonesian film, but if you're talking about a French film.
Sure.
A British reader has far more anchors, cultural anchors, when it comes to French cinema, or France in general, French culture in general, than she or he does with Indonesian cinema or culture.
Absolutely.
So you can't use quite the same shorthand to discuss things. You have to develop ways to sell. I'm using sell in a not commercial sense really, but persuade somebody to be interested in a film from a culture they may not know so well, and by a director they've never heard of.
Take a chance on something.
Take a risk. Take a chance on something. And you develop certain strategies for doing this. I mean, I hope I found some, but I'm well aware that this is not the kind of thoughtful film criticism I'm looking at. This is essentially PR work. I'm doing unpaid PR work on behalf of films that I think are really interesting, and that I'm persuaded other viewers would also find interesting.
I mean, that's the key thing.
If they took a chance on it.
It's because you respond and respect to the work that you're doing. So we've got a bunch of questions coming in.
Oh my God.
What are Tony's recollections of the Edinburgh Film Festival during the 70s? Was he involved with any programming at the festival?
My meal, I similarly to what I did with Kem Lashin, I did come back from trips to the Far East with recommendations of films I thought should be seen more widely. And in the late 70s, the director of Edinburgh Film Festival was Linda Miles, who was an extremely nice person who became a friend, and a very smart cinephile woman, I think. She also, like Kem Lashin in a very different way, had a very open mind and was very easily persuaded that there was something there for her, something worth exploring and investigating. So she was also open to suggestions, and as a result, we did show films like Alan Fong's Father and Son, Anne Huy's The Spooky Bunch and The Secret, Choi Hak's Butterfly Murders, and Dangerous Encounter First Time, played in Edinburgh as well, because at that time there was no exclusivity between London and Edinburgh. London came later on. London came to say, if it's in Edinburgh, we don't want to show it here. We can't overlap.
Right. Sure,
As if there's the same audience.
Exactly. Pointless.
Completely stupid. That still prevails now, I think.
Definitely. Premier.
If it's shown in Edinburgh, it can't be considered for London. A really stupid thing.
It works not in anyone's favour.
Absolutely anybody's interest, and certainly not least of all the interest of the filmmakers and distributors. Anyhow, leaving that aside, back in those days, there was no such distinction, and if something was seen in Edinburgh and discovered in Edinburgh, it went on to be invited to London, and with profit to everybody. For example, John Carpenter's Assault on Precinct 13 had its first British screening, first world screening almost, in Edinburgh. It was a sensation in Edinburgh, and consequently was added to the London Film Festival programme, where it was even more of a sensation. John Carpenter came, he got a 10-minute standing ovation from a full NFT1, and was then interviewed on stage by somebody who was as much of a Hawksian as Carpenter himself, and they had an extremely knowledgeable discussion on the film's roots in the cinema of Howard Hawks, and it was wonderful. It was an absolutely wonderful occasion. The audience adored the film, adored the Q&A, adored everything about it, and Carpenter left the country, on cloud nine. I mean, he had no idea what. This is a man who was being ignored in Hollywood. He also sold the film for distribution to a company called Miracle, run by a very nice elderly Jewish gent called Michael Myers.
Yes, indeed.
Whose name was paid tribute to in Mr. Carpenter's very next film, a film called Halloween.
And his son Martin Myers still runs Miracle now. We've got about 5 minutes left,
Tony.
Sorry. So we're going to just probably end up with one final question, and one popped out here from someone called Mark. Do cinemas still have a significant role in the age of online? And
of course they do. Listen, this last weekend, for the first time in quite a while, I went to crowded auditoriums. I saw a couple of films at the London Film Festival, and it was my first visit to a big scale auditorium for quite a long time. And one experience was horrible. It was in the London Royal Festival Hall, and a huge place, not built as a cinema, it's built as a concert hall. And it's been used as a cinema by the London Film Festival. And it was a very horrible experience in many ways. The film was great, but the disruptions caused by latecomers and people getting up to go to the toilet, and by other people holding up their phones to take photos illegally off the screen, other kinds of disruption, were just really, really irritating. I found myself sitting there thinking, I wish I could be seeing this in privacy and comfort and silence at home,
Please don't end this talk on that note, Tony.
No, the following night I went to the Prince Charles Cinema to see another film in the London Film Festival, great Indonesian film called Vengeance is Mine, All Others Pay Cash. It's the fourth feature by a young filmmaker called Edwin, who is a friend of mine, and he made a number of very distinguished shorts early in his life, and then has made features more recently. This is the latest one. It won the top prize in Locarno Film Festival, the Golden Leopard in Locarno a few months ago. And so I was very, very keen to see this film. And Edwin kindly organised a ticket for me, one of his comp tickets that is offered to the filmmaker. And so I saw the film. I had a number of Indonesians around me who had obviously heard through the grapevine that this Indonesian film, which had won a prize somewhere, was on in London. So they came to see it, and they responded very loudly and warmly to the jokes in the film and to the shocks in the film, both of which are quite widely present. And the cinema was not completely packed. It wasn't full, but it was decently busy. It was respectively busy, and a good audience feeling from this crowd. And that was an absolute joy. Yeah. So I had an experience in Prince Charles that night that was not available to me online. Yeah. It's an experience that is unreproducible in any other circumstance. There's no other way to get this than to be in a cinema like the Prince Charles on that night. It was great. Brilliant. So, no.
Right. Okay. I feel we've only sort of scratched the surface of what we could talk about. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 conversation.
We didn't talk about sex for one thing. I mean, there's all kinds of areas that we could have gone into.
Yeah, there's so much. All of humanity, really, we could have gone into, Tony. Yes, sex included. Yes. But I think all that remains is for me to say thank you so much, Tony, for telling us, just, you know, for giving us just a snapshot of what I know is a much, much deeper career. And it's been such a pleasure, as always.
As they say on Design Discs, thank you for having me. Thank you. You're very kind to have asked.
It's a pleasure. And I think we're going to hand it back now to Selena, who's going to close off the evening.
Yes. Oh, my goodness. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Simon. That was just incredible. I mean, these are just histories and stories that are just not written in any book. You know, I mean, this is just absolute gold dust. So thank you so much for just giving us these insights about how you started programming and writing and meeting filmmakers, and I mean, there's just so much that you covered, and I think we should definitely, if you'd like to come back to do a part 2, because we could always talk about sex.
Sex in the 90s.
We are going to talk about sex in the
90s.
Oh, God, this is going to be so embarrassing.
No, because I want to hear more about this book, Motion Companion to Saviors of Violence in the Cinema. I mean, that just sounds incredible.
Motion was a small magazine. It lasted only 6 issues, I think, but it was absolutely great while it lasted.
It was potent.
Yeah, it was, yes.
So anyway, thank you so much for giving up your time for us this evening. And Simon, thank you so much for being a fantastic moderator. And so I'm just going to close our event this evening just by telling you what we've got coming up on the platform next week. So from next Thursday the 28th, we are screening 2 films by a filmmaker called Franza Woods. She is an incredible Black filmmaker who made 2 beautiful short films in the late 70s in New York. Her films are really funny, very down to earth, and brilliantly, beautifully made. And we are showing 2 of her films on the platform, Fanny's Film and Killing Time. And we have a new filmed interview with Franza by director Nadia Latif. And Nadia's also written something for our blog about Franza's films. Nadia went to visit Franza. She lives in southwest France, so she went to visit her there in her home to interview her. And I really urge you to come back to watch Franza's films and watch this incredible filmed interview with her that we will be streaming on the platform next Thursday for a week. And then we've got some more exciting stuff coming up afterwards, but I'll just tell you about Franza Woods now. So thank you everyone for coming this evening. Please come back to the Cinema of Ideas and tell your friends, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.